My talk here today revolves around the very particular case of the acquisition of archive material of the poet, translator and publisher John Riley. And I hope to share with you a sense of the intricate pathways down which one might expect to proceed in pursuit of the past. I say in pursuit of the past quite deliberately because when one reads the correspondence of a group of friends who were up at Cambridge at roughly the same time in the early 1960s, there is an intimacy of communication which seems to place flesh upon the dry bones of biographical history, which is a little akin to the world of the French historical school, annales. When one reads such immediate accounts of thoughts and events put down on paper in a pre-electronic age, to be sent between friends who had gone different professional ways after leaving university and who now lived in different parts of the country, it is as though the vividness of that past possesses a moment of resplende. I mentioned that word before. That comes from the Canto 93 section Rock Drill from Pound. It shines. In order to get the context in place, it is necessary to say a few words of biographical detail concerning not only John Riley, but also his two particular friends, Tim Longville and Michael Grant. Riley was born in Leeds in 1937, and after doing A-levels was called up for national service, joining the Royal Air Force in 1956. It was during this period, some of which he spent in Germany, that he learned Russian. In 1958, he went to Pembroke College to read English, graduating in 1961. And it was at Pembroke that he met Tim Longville, who was also reading English, and with whom he was to found Grosseteste Press in 1966 and Grosseteste Review, the first issue of which appeared in 1968. After leaving Cambridge, John taught in primary schools in and around the Cambridge area before moving to Bicester near Oxford. His first book of poems, Ancient and Modern, was published by Grosseteste in 1967. Some of these poems had already appeared in the English Intelligencer, the privately circulated poetry worksheet which ran over 3 series comprising nearly 40 individual issues from January 1966 to April 1968, and which had been started by Andrew Crozier and Jeremy Prynne. Crozier, a graduate from Christ's College, had recently returned from sunny Buffalo, where he had been studying under Charles Olson, and was about to join the newly founded English department at the University of Essex at the invitation of Donald Davy. Prynne, of course, was a fellow at Keys. In 1967, Riley and Longville published a jointly translated version of some poems by Hölderlin, under the title In the Arms of the Gods. These attempts at translating the German Romantic poet can be traced back some years because in 1963, Riley had clearly sent some of them to Michael Hamburger at the University of Reading to sound out his views. And the reply from Hamburger can now be found in this new archive. Here's a sentence from it. I've marked a few passages in this. As for your arrangement of the lines in the archipelago, I'm sorry to say I'm completely against it. You mention natural pauses for breath, but surely, if Hölderlin wrote in long lines and knew his job, the length of those lines bears some relation to his natural breathing in the poem. The impression your version makes on me is one of extremely short breath, a kind of gasping in verse. Hölderlin had the longest breath of any poet I know, so that he had to overflow not only lines, but stanzas and sections. I'm also against this kind of arrangement, because it is modish and finicky. I can see the point of it in Pound, who started all this, because he was applying an imagist technique in long poems, so that his object was to give full weight to the individual image and phrase. Hamburger also goes on to express some despair at the publishing world of the time. I'm trying to find a publisher for my own Hölderlin translations, the fourth and last attempt, and have almost given up hope of finding one in England. I think you too would do well to look to America. In 1970, Riley published What Reason Was, a collection of poems drawn from what he'd been writing for the last 2 years, many of which had appeared in those magazines of the late 60s, which act as a type of record of an alternative scene to what some might see as the mainstream. Resuscitator, edited by John James. Collection, edited by Peter Riley. The Park, edited from Essex and then Kiel by Crozier. Grosseteste Review itself. It was at about this time that he gave up school teaching in order to devote himself more completely to his writing, and Riley moved to Cornwall briefly and then returned to Leeds, where he spent the rest of his life, with the exception of a short but significant visit to Istanbul in 1973. John Riley married Carol in 1973, and in 1977 was received into the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1973, his volume of poetry was published, containing 3 sections of Zagrad, 2 of which were republished from Grosseteste Review. I'll say a little bit more about that poem in a moment. Riley's last volume of poems to be published in his lifetime was That Is Today. Came from Pig Press, 1978, before he was murdered by 2 muggers outside a pub in the Chapel Allerton area of Leeds on the 27th of October, 1978. Tim Longville organised the publication of a volume of tributes to Riley, published in 1979, and then the collected works, which appeared in 1980. And it was here that the final version of Zagrad appeared. When it first started, this long poem Zagrad, appearing in Grosseteste Review 6, attracted the attention of Jeremy Prynne, who wrote a letter to Longville thanking him for he'd received the magazine, and Prynne wrote the following: "For what strikes me is how openly placed the poem is to receive whatever fruits are ripe. Mostly up to now the forms have been very tight, with theology to match, and the life within purged from these 2 margins. And now he can hardly finish a sentence. I can't help thinking of some sweet rain falling steadily over the fields, gracefully immune to human denial, and Riley, moved even more than moving others, the elegist, turning to psalms. Of course it will look like maudlin theism to some, cathected into the lyric stream, and the dangers of this are part of the risk we are part of. The very name of love is a sign of distinction, for love is not established by one but by 2, by the lover and by that which he loves. These minds, therefore, that have been accounted worthy, for they leave behind them every name that is called and distinct and defining, and now becomes nameless, above name, speechless, above speech." The development of that major poem, Zagrad, which centres on an imagined Eastern Orthodox city shining a little with Byzantine gold, ambiguously holding out promise of true government, of true citizenship, and held in mind sight by tremulous energies of artistic creativity, that's not me, that's Doug Oliver, writing a review in PN Review in 1981. It continued in ways of approaching, where the 3rd section was added. And the work in progress, part of a 4th section, was also published in Grosseteste in 1974, before the completed section in draft form was sent to Michael Grant for comment. And the central place that this sequence held in John Riley's mind is highlighted perhaps by the fact that when Andrew Crozier produced an anthology of 10 English poets for James Lauchlan's New Directions, published in 1976, Riley's contribution was the first part of Zagrad, and the importance of the continuing development of the work was emphasised by Riley in an undated letter to Grant when he suggested, no, Zagrad's not progressed beyond part 4 and isn't liable to my own small, long, dark night may have begun. It's even impossible for me to imagine what it must be like to write a poem. However, in spite of that view, a letter to Grant from March 78 opens, Zagrad seems to be sprouting a part 5. Whether genuine extension or self-parody, I know not. But since it doesn't seem available to me to write otherwise, I'll stick with it and see what develops. I am not aware that anything remains of those shoots, unless they are a few lines which appear in the uncollected poems section of Tim Longville's large volume. The 4 sections that existed in the collected works present the reader with an intricate and persuasive exploration of the language of the spirit, and they represent a remarkable achievement. And it's worth noting here that the progress of the poem was followed by Ian Sinclair, who wrote to Grant in November 74, yes, I follow Zagrad with a keen eye. It's a work I greatly admire, along with the Prynne opus. The way is the way on, putting muscle into the eye, taking courage in the breath. Fire is breathed into straw by finding that these activities are not entirely solitary and crazy for these times. In 1995, Carcanet published a selected poems of John Riley, long, long out of print, edited by Michael Grant. Since then, over the last nearly 20 years, near enough silence about John Riley. In 2009, at a conference about the work of Charles Olson, held at the University of Kent, I met Michael Grant. He'd recently retired from being senior lecturer in film studies there, and was one of those involved in organising the conference. We quickly struck up a friendship which was doubtless fuelled by both being Keans, albeit with 10 years between us, both of us being taught by Prynne. We started to meet quite regularly, and over the following months much conversation revolved around those early days of the 60s and Grant's connections with Longville, Riley, Crozier and the novelist Tom Sharp. Michael was trying to get his papers sorted out in preparation for a move of house, and asked me to look after some boxes of what appeared at first glance to be a jumble of empty envelopes, letters, typescripts, ephemera. Acting in the manner of a very basic secretary, I started putting letters and envelopes together, sorting out the different correspondence, and as I did so, a picture started to appear. John Riley, Longville, Grant, they remained for many years in the habit of writing to each other about their own poetry, as well as about what they were reading. And in the wealth of correspondence, I read about the setting up of Grosseteste, the background to the publication of Grant's own poetry, which the press put out in 1967. And since I was myself engaged at this time with putting together the Andrew Crozier Reader for Carcanet, and in looking through the enormous archive of correspondence which Crozier had meticulously kept, the whole enterprise of a reconstruction of the past became increasingly fascinating, and it happened to coincide with the emergence of this new university library's interest in a poetry archive. Grant was very pleased for his papers to be donated to this new archive, and it was he who initially suggested to me that I ought to inquire concerning what might have happened to all those works and papers and drafts of John Riley, murdered so many years ago. Well, where better to start on this trail, which would lead back to 78, than Tim Longville, of course. And my springboard wasn't an altogether promising one. A card from years earlier, which Longville had sent to Grant, telling him, "No, I don't write poems. I haven't done for years. One day the swine just upped and left me. No forwarding address. Nothing to be done. Not a fate I'm alone in, at least. I write very little of anything anymore, and what I do is mostly, prepare to laugh, about plants and gardens." Now, Tim Longville had been involved in the anthology of poems of various art, along with Andrew Crozier, and of course along with Anthony Barnett, who sits among us today, who appeared in a various art. So when Crozier's papers concerning the editing of that volume arrived at the library, it seemed that the correct way to proceed would be to advise Longville of this. That's just courtesy, not a correspondence in the library. So I wrote to Tim's Gardening Books publisher in July 2012 and received the following reply. "Dear Ian, Francis Lincoln passed your email on to me. It was courteous to let me know about the project, in particular insofar as it relates to a certain art. I can't think of any reason why I'd need more details than simply to know it's happening." Now, that didn't sound very promising to me. And so I wrote again, mentioning that Michael Grant had donated an important archive of correspondence, Longville, Riley, much of it about Grosseteste Press, and that Tim might have interesting materials himself, which he had kept from those days, and the reply came swift. "Sorry, not my sort of thing. That sort of academicization of poetry via the endless accumulation in university libraries of what are in effect no more than laundry lists sends chills down my spine and always did. Infinitely better to let the naked reader confront the naked poem." Over the next couple of months, I started reading Longville's own poetry with a greater sense of care. And this led in turn to my writing a piece for PN Review on the early Grosseteste volumes of both himself and Michael Grant. And I intended this to be one of two pieces of writing, the second focusing on John Riley. The article was published in March 2013 and concluded with the comment that there was to be a companion piece relating to Riley. And I sent a copy up north to Tim. And he wrote back, "Thanks for the copy of PN Review. The piece, and in this case the whole issue, does seem very strange to me. Not my world. Not any longer, at least, me. Generous of you to undertake it, though, even if I tend to think, don't take this amiss, that attention given to your allotment would have been a more fruitful use of your time. I hope at least that Michael Grant is pleased with how he figures in it. He should be. As for the John Riley piece, his widow is now in the last stages of MS and in sheltered accommodation, so may not even be able to read it, although friends may be able to read it to her. But I'm sure she'd like to see it. Perhaps you could send me a copy that I could pass on to her. Or if you'll let me know when you have a publication date, I'll let you have her present address." Well, a few days further on, Tim wrote with the address. The Laureates, Shakespeare Road, Guiseley, Leeds, and added she always had a wry and dry sense of humour and was amused by the excessive appropriateness of that address for the widow of a poet. I sent my article to Carol Riley and on May the 1st, 2013 received a letter from her. "Dear Ian, I apologise for my improbable address. The patron of my flat is Alfred Austin, arguably the worst poet laureate ever, but a talented grower of impressive facial hair. John's archive is packaged in 2 large boxes. I'm afraid I cannot offer to bring them, as I'm a full-time wheelchair user. As John has no family as far as I'm aware, I would like to donate the copyright of both the archive and the work to the university library. Can you tell me how to do this? Needless to say, I contacted the library immediately and matters came speedily to a head. I spoke on the phone to Carol Riley, arranged a call on her at Guiseley on May the 13th, and as I looked through the boxes, it became increasingly clear that this was a find of considerable importance. We'd hit the jackpot. The boxes contained an extraordinary range of correspondence dealing with the setting up and early years of Grosseteste, the drafts unpublished of Riley's poems, his notebooks, unpublished translations of Mandelstam, which was the last enterprise he was involved with 35 years ago. Carol Riley was delighted with the outcome, and talking to her I quickly realised that this could all have gone so badly wrong. It's just possible that those boxes of papers and notebooks might have simply ended up being overlooked and then being put in a tip, instead of finding their way to the university library, where quite a few of them were on display in an exhibition earlier on this year. A past brought back to life. I make no apology in using the word again, resplende. Thank you very much.